everyone, and welcome back to Tea Time Thoughts. I'm Kaylin, as always, and today I feel kind of like an imposter because I'm not drinking tea. I'm having some berry-flavored Propel because it's really hot here, and I did a lot of work outside today, so I just wanted to have something kind of cool and refreshing. But I'm also going to be visiting some family in California this weekend, and the high on Sunday is projected to be 107 degrees, so send prayers my way, please. It's okay. We'll have AC. Everything will be fine. And before we get started, I want to give a shout out to the History Obscura Forgotten True Stories podcast. I just want to say that they have a wonderful podcast. You'll definitely love this one. So that's History Obscura Forgotten True Stories. So today, while I drink Berry Propel, imagine having that as the name of my podcast. Propel Thoughts or something. That sounds, I don't know, like some sort of motivational conference or something. I don't know. Anyway, so as I drink my Propel today, I'm going to talk to you guys about Lord George Gordon Byron, or as I'm probably just going to refer to him, Lord Byron. Or if you've watched the Drunk History on Lord Byron and you want to make the jokes with me, Lord Byron. I'm sorry, I'll try to keep that down to a minimum, but how I want to start this off is by reading you a poem that Byron wrote in 1814, and it's called She Walks in Beauty, and it's a very beautiful poem. It's actually one of my favorites. She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes. Thus mellowed to that tender light which heaven to gaudy day denies, one shade the more, one ray the less, have half impaired the nameless grace which waves in every raven tress, or softly lightens o'er her face, where thoughts serenely sweet express how pure, how dear their dwelling place. And on that cheek and o'er that brow, so soft, so calm, yet eloquent, the smiles that win, the tints that glow, but tell of days in goodness spent, a mind at peace with all below, a heart whose love is innocent. So very beautiful. When I took my class on classical and romantic literature, when I read this, I was like, oh my gosh, that's absolutely beautiful. So when you hear about a poem like this, you would think it sounds very tender, and it sounds like a love that would linger long after its end. It would be something that, I don't know, basically fairy tales are made out of. Would you believe it's written by a man who had affairs with over 300 women? That's probably the best segue I could give you into introducing Lord Byron. Honestly, that's one of the things that draws us to his character. He seems kind of like this legendary figure, so we're like, no way, somebody wouldn't do that. Who's got the time? Who's got the stamina? But that's Lord Byron for us. And not only is he one of the first people to really be considered a celebrity in his time, because his life sounds so legendary, he's transcended that status that he had during his lifetime. And to us, he's almost kind of this legendary figure. And he's also kind of the perfect choice for this podcast today, because the previous poet that I talked about in my 4th episode was William Wordsworth, and he's actually a contemporary of Lord Byron. And what's interesting is there was actually a bit of a feud between the two poets, or perhaps it was a bit more on Byron's side and just Byron disliked Wordsworth, but he actually nicknamed him, and we see this in some of Byron's letters, we see Byron referring to Wordsworth as Turdsworth. And yes, that is kind of funny, but also I'm a big Wordsworth stan. He's my boy, so Byron, fight me. You're gonna come against Wordsworth like that? You gotta put up with me. And you know what? You were only 5'8". I've got a whole inch on you, buddy. You're going down. I didn't realize I had that kind of rage in me. I'm sorry. Let's go ahead and get into Byron's history, because it's something that's very interesting. So depending on the sources that you read, some people say that Byron had a pretty difficult relationship with his mom, and people are very quick to jump on that and say, oh, his bad childhood is the reason why Byron went on to become like a womanizer later in his life. But other accounts say that she was very kind to him and supportive, and she provided him with a lot of opportunities to learn and to read as a child, which would have inspired him as he went on to write his own works. So it's something that we can't pin down definitively, but it is also likely that Byron was abused by his governess as a child. So depending on whether or not these facts are true, it would provide a great deal of insight into his works and his life. Even if this isn't true, his life is still one that is very fascinating and one to delve into. So he was actually known for being a very active child, despite the fact that he was actually born with a deformed foot, and he would walk with a bit of a limp, and he was very insecure about this, as I'm sure we all would be growing up with this as a child. So he even gave himself the French nickname Le Diable Boiteux, meaning the limping devil. But despite his insecurity, he also refused to wear a brace or anything that might help with his limp, and he had specially made shoes to sort of hide it. So we can get an idea of not only his insecurity, but his vanity, and he actually has a lot of different routines that we might find kind of funny. So we know that he was very handsome for his day. I think that if you look at some of his portraits, you would say he's still pretty handsome for this day as well. I mean, if I met him now, I would definitely think he's attractive. And the one thing that would probably keep me from really being interested in him is the fact that he probably had hepatitis A through Q, but nevertheless, he was still quite a good-looking man, and he not only knew it, but he took efforts to maintain that kind of beauty. So we know he was very particular about his appearance. He even wore curlers in his hair, or they were curling papers. He would put these on at night before he went to bed, and he was also very, very particular about his weight. Because of his clubbed foot, despite the fact that he really enjoyed being active, and his abilities were definitely limited, and some people have kind of pinned this to why his weight fluctuated so much throughout his life, but he would usually keep himself on a very strict diet, usually a vegetarian diet, in which he would only eat vegetables, dry biscuits, and drink white wine. But when he did indulge, he would have a lot of food. He would just gorge himself, particularly in a lot of meat and sweets and desserts, and afterwards he would purge himself and start the diet over afterward. And one thing to consider is that despite how seriously and honestly pretty sad that is, because he's a man, a lot of people are quick to kind of laugh at that, especially because it's Lord Byron, and Lord Byron's usually somebody that we kind of want to poke fun at. But the thing is, it really does show how insecure he was, and probably how unhappy he was with himself. It's not a happy life to live, to constantly survey your food like that, and to punish yourself if you indulge too much. It's not fun, and growing up, I had a really hard time figuring out what was the right way to have a healthy relationship with food. I think a lot of people in general sort of have this struggle, so it's easy for us to kind of relate to Byron in this way, because it's so easy to let our insecurities kind of eat into who we are. So despite his weight issues, he really did enjoy being active when he could. He enjoyed swimming, he enjoyed running, boxing, things like that. And these were also a good outlet for him physically, because he also had quite a temper. And it was said at one point, as a kid, he got so angry that he bit a china teacup so hard that he broke off a piece of it. But he wasn't just a curly-haired, angry man. He also was a very big animal lover. At one point during his childhood, when one of his dogs had rabies, he tried to stay with the dog and nurse it back to health, despite the fact that the dog could bite him and infect him as well. He wanted to be there, and he also had quite a few crazy pets during his lifetime as well. When he was in school, he owned a tamed bear, and throughout his life it was said that he also owned monkeys and peacock. And honestly, if you Google some of Lord Byron's pets, it's pretty fun. And so once Byron kind of grew up and started going to school, he was able to receive a very good education. He studied at Trinity College in Cambridge, and in between his education and hanging out with his pet bear, he also started to develop his appetite, if you will, for promiscuity. And he called his feelings of violent though pure love and passion. And what's interesting about this is during this time, while he was exploring his sexuality, he also realized that he was bisexual. He fell in love with a young chorister named John Edelston, but he was also very strongly attracted to women, and he began to write and publish some of his first poems during this time, and he made friendships with people who would help him develop his interest in politics later. And the political scene is something that would be Byron's other great love. So aside from loving other people, he would really be very invested and interested in politics, as we see, especially towards the end of his life. So from one of his early poems, The Cornelian, he hints at an encounter between him and chorister John Edelston, in which Edelston gave him a ring, and Byron wrote about that in this stanza here. He offered it with downcast look, as fearful though I might refuse it. I told him, when the gift I took, my only fear should be to lose it. And I think that's very sweet. I think it shows sort of this innocence and a younger love and the nerves that come along as you're trying to figure all of that out. It's also a demonstration of Byron's kind of more humble beginnings as a poet. So from about 1807 onward, Byron's career really starts to build. And not only is he publishing works of poetry, but he's also taken a seat in the House of Lords. And he eventually will go on to give speeches in the House of Lords as well. And he can publicly discuss the things that he's passionate about. And then in 1809, he went on his grand tour of Europe, but he had to mainly travel through the Mediterranean because of the conflicts in Central and Eastern Europe due to the Napoleonic Wars, but this actually ended up working out pretty well for Byron. He really loved the Mediterranean. In particular, he loved Greece. That's where he really felt a connection, and that was something that would last throughout his entire life. He liked how the Greek people were very blunt and open compared to quiet and more reserved British lifestyle that he was familiar with. And so eventually, after spending some time in Europe, Byron goes back and gets settled in England again, and this is where some of the big scandals kind of start to pop up around Byron. He's made a name for himself. Now the public is more aware of him, and in the summer of 1813, he had an affair with his half-sister, and eventually he tried to cover that up by proposing marriage to a woman named Anne Isabella Milbank, and they had a daughter together, but basically the marriage wasn't really going anywhere, and it was just kind of stale for both of them. So 3 years later, they separated. But after all of this, Byron would face a lot of rumors about his marriage and why it ended, his affair with his sister, and even claims about his bisexuality, which at the time would have been especially dangerous, and Byron could face criminal charges for this. So to kind of take a step away from all of this, he goes on a holiday in Geneva with his friend Percy by Shelley and Shelley's soon-to-be wife Mary, who you might recognize as Mary Shelley, who was the author of Frankenstein, and she actually developed the idea for Frankenstein during that trip to Geneva. And Byron also invited his personal doctor, and this part of Byron's life I love because this is the part that's covered in Drunk History. And I know that's not the greatest resource as far as studying someone's life, but it definitely helped pique an interest for me, and I don't know, some of the quotes in it are just hilarious as well. So if you want to check that out sometime, I recommend it. So not only are Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley being inspired on this trip, but the trip was also inspiring for Byron because he's surrounded by the beauty of Switzerland and he produces a lot of poetry during this time. And you can also see that he was definitely dealing with some internal conflicts. And of course, this is very fitting for Romanticism because so much of the great works of the day contemplate the internal struggles of man and the duality and good and bad in everybody. But he's just coming off of this backlash that he's receiving back at home, and so he's trying to escape it, and he's probably internalizing a lot of that and trying to figure out what to do. So in his dramatic poem Manfred, he laments that man is half dust, half deity, alike unfit to sink or soar. And looking at that line alone, we can get a very close look at Byron's character. He goes back and forth in thinking that he's excellent, that he's very handsome, and he's this grand figure and he's untouchable and perhaps even invincible. But he has moments where he thinks that he's worthless and he falls into these depressions. That's why he was also known by some of his friends as the gloomy egoist. And I'll get into that after this.
Hello and welcome to the History Obscura podcast. This is the place where history's forgotten secrets are unshelved from my vast, firelit book repository and reintroduced to the world. Learn stories of space exploration, medieval royals, smugglers, martyrs, and monsters. Subscribe to History Obscura for a fresh tale every Saturday and Tuesday night.
And now, back to the story. Eventually, after this trip in Switzerland, Byron makes his way over to Italy, and his indulgences, as you might say, over in Italy, they could be an attempt to take in as much pleasure as he could to distract from whatever he was feeling or dealing with on the inside. So he makes his way over to Italy, and we see a lot more of his somewhat fantastical affairs. And it was said that Italy had more loose customs and less of a stiff traditional vibe during that time. So he really commits to this lifestyle. He sleeps with his landlord's wife. He sleeps with the baker's wife. He has a slew of different mistresses, and he spends like a madman because he managed to sell some of his property back in England. So he used that money to pay off his debts and like the extra to basically just enjoy himself. And I don't know if this is true, but there's this wonderful post that I saw circulated around Tumblr and Pinterest a while ago that some of my friends and I joke about. But it said at one point when Byron took a trip over to Paris, he had so many relations in a short amount of time that Shelley basically found him depleted of all bodily fluid, almost left for dead somewhere on a Paris street. And after hearing about this, another poet named John Keats, who also had a bit of a feud with Byron, said, "You should have just left him there." And I tried to fact check this to see if this was real. I had a hard time finding sources for it, so this could be totally made up. But it's just one of those things I really hope that was real because, oh my gosh, I just think Keats' response is iconic. So it's during this time in Byron's life that he writes perhaps his most famous poem, if you would call it a poem. It's a very long, epic poem, and it's called Don Juan. And also, that's not me calling it epic. That's the type of poem that it was. But Don Juan is about 17 cantos long, and it has a total of about 16,000 lines. And Byron actually died before he finished the whole thing, so it could have been so much longer, but there's this grand story about Don Juan going through and seducing all these different women, and some of these women include Catherine the Great of Russia, and clearly he's taking steps back in time with his writing this story because Catherine the Great died in 1796. But basically, Don Juan is created as this larger-than-life figure, and he is a legendary figure that people were already familiar with. He was this fictional Spanish libertine figure and the complete archetype for a womanizer. So as we read through this, we kind of have this overhanging sense of Byron's own self coming through. We have this connection that we see because we have Byron's political leanings as someone who's a bit more of a liberal Whig, and we see his romantic endeavors as well. So it's no wonder that he might be compared to Don Juan. And if you want to just kind of get an insight for it, it's a super long poem, so I wanted to pick something a bit general and less story-based. I picked the first canto, and it says, "I want a hero, an uncommon want, when every year and month sends forth a new one, till after cloying the gazettes with cant, the age discovers he is not the true one. Of such things I should not have come to vaunt. I'll therefore take our ancient friend Don Juan. We have all seen him in the pantomime, sent to the devil somewhat ere his time." So that last line there, taken to the devil basically before he's old, in the myth, as we see in Don Giovanni, Don Juan gets swallowed up into the pits of hell for all of his sins. But it's actually kind of prophetic in a way that Byron writes this, because Byron would end up dying fairly young. He died at the age of 36. And I think that his writing of this poem is, in a way, it's almost like an autobiography of sorts. He's sort of tying up the rest of the details of his life because he's entering what are, I'm guessing, are unbeknownst to him, the last few years of his life. So Byron starts to dig back into his radical politics, and he joins a society to liberate Italy from Austria. And eventually, when he does go back to England, in 1823, he's offered the chance to work for the London Committee, which is formed to help Greece earn their independence from Turkish rule. And if you remember what we mentioned earlier, Byron loved Greece. He was very enamored with the country and the Greek people. So he puts a lot of himself into this, and he even sent £4,000 to help finance the efforts of the Greeks against the Turks. And he eventually even decided that he should just go down there himself to fight. And he took personal command of a brigade of soldiers that was said to be among the bravest of them. And he was very excited, and I think he probably felt very fulfilled to be a part of this. But in February 1824, he started to come down with a severe fever, and 2 months later, in April, he died. And he died because he had just been completely worn down. And it's very likely that it could have been malaria, but sources will differ somewhat depending on what you read. And allegedly, his last words were, "O questo è una bella scena," which translates from Italian to, "Oh, what a beautiful scene." And again, that's a very romanticist way to look at something. I think the view of death from a romanticist perspective is that death is something natural, and in a way it's a rejoining with the world in which you live. And I think that with Byron's depressions and his conflicts about being a good person or a bad person, being valuable or worthless, I think that he in a way had probably thought about his death a lot and had probably wondered how he was going to die as well. So I think because his death took place while he was in the midst of fighting for something that he believed in, I think that might have been something that was fulfilling for him. And what's ironic about his death is when his body was eventually returned to England, he was refused burial in Westminster Abbey. But 145 years later, they finally placed a plaque on the floor of Westminster Abbey for Lord Byron in the Poets' Corner. And it's funny, too, because you get to see him there with some of his good friends and also some of the people that he didn't like and who he made turd puns about their names. Am I being salty? Maybe just a little bit. So beyond his death, Byron's legacy is still going very strong. Even if you haven't really heard of him before this, he was the inspiration for creating a character archetype known as the Byronic hero. And that's usually someone who's like an emotionally tortured soul, who's both intelligent but arrogant, and self-aware but ruthless. And he's usually got some sort of troubled past or wrongdoing that he's trying to separate himself from. And examples of these are Heathcliff from Wuthering Heights, we have Steerforth, we have the Phantom of the Opera, and some people have even gone as far to say Edward Cullen is a Byronic hero, which I guess they're not wrong, but I don't know. I don't want to put Edward Cullen on the list compared to like Heathcliff and Phantom of the Opera. And back to Byron, we honestly can't say that he's not an interesting figure to study, and I think that the characters inspired by him are interesting as well because they're usually very, if they're not multidimensional, they're at least, they have dual perspectives of the world. And we could spend a long time just trying to pick out what's going on in their brains and wondering why the heck they're doing the things that they're doing. But ultimately, these characters are inspired by Lord Byron. He has this fascinating back and forth that once we get past all the crazy affairs and the wild politics, that keeps people interested in wanting to know more about him. So to finish off, Byron is somebody worth remembering in literature because he's able to garner this incredible skill as a writer to create a story like we see in Don Juan, but he can also weave in commentary and satire, and he deals with themes that are pretty similar to today because since he was considered one of the first celebrities, he grapples with the idea of his fame and not only how it's negatively impacted his life, but also whether or not he deserves the fame that he has and whether or not the work that he does merits the attention that it gets. And I think that's a mold that a lot of celebrities constantly find themselves in because when you give your life to your audience or to the people, it's not one that you can keep to yourself anymore. And because he was so critical of his works and of himself, you can see a constant uncertainty of whether or not he felt like he was good enough. He was also so critical of his own works and of himself that you can see this constant uncertainty of whether or not he felt like he was good enough. So behind all of the satire, there is this outline of a man. The man that we see might be a bit too real to be comfortable because perhaps it reminds us just a little bit too much of ourselves. So that's it for this week. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you want to like, follow, subscribe, whatever the platform you're listening to will allow you to do, please do. If you feel like writing a review, you can go to ratethispodcast.com/teatimethoughts to do so, and I would greatly appreciate that. It really does help to boost the podcast. And I actually have a couple of fun announcements. So I started an Instagram for my podcast where I'll post updates about the podcast, and you can also use this to recommend podcast ideas to me or give me feedback. I love hearing what you guys have to say. I love hearing about all your insights. So if you're interested, follow at Tea Time Thoughts Podcast. I also started a YouTube channel as well for the podcast, just to upload the audio onto another platform that people could use. So if you go to the Tea Time Thoughts Podcast YouTube channel, you can subscribe there. And the good thing is, if you're interested, it's a small channel, so there aren't ads on the video yet, so you can listen to it uninterrupted. I also want to thank Mandy over at the History Obscura Forgotten True Stories podcast. If you guys like this podcast, I think you'll really enjoy hers. She digs into a lot of really interesting subjects, and she has created something that's very interesting and entertaining and something that keeps you on the edge of your seat. So I definitely recommend going and checking out her podcast. And again, if you have any ideas for future episodes or anything you'd like to see, I would love to hear what you have to say. So please let me know. And thank you for listening. Don't forget to tune in next week when I talk about the story behind the famous portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer. Thank you again for listening. This is Tea Time Thoughts, and I'll talk to you next week.